That morning, a wild herd of elephants appeared at the rescue gate without making a sound. They did not charge. They did not threaten. They simply stood there, as if guarding a secret too heartbreaking to let go. And when they slowly stepped aside, the people inside were stunned to find a dying newborn calf lying in the red dust, its tiny body marked by a tragedy no one yet understood. But the most chilling part was this. The herd did not seem to come to fight humans. They came to ask for help. And what happened next would go far beyond anything any of them had ever believed was possible. Before sunrise, Red Clay Elephant Refuge lay in a hush so complete it felt borrowed from another world. The mopane trees stood motionless against a bruised blue sky, and the long grass held the last of the night's cold. In the nursery barn, heaters hummed for calves that already belonged to humans. Beyond the outer fence, the wild still kept its own counsel. Ethan Cole was the first to notice something was wrong. He had walked that perimeter road every morning for 6 years, coffee cooling in one hand, radio clipped to his belt, boots tracing the same red dirt path. So when he saw shapes gathered at the gate in the dim light, he stopped at once. Nothing about them looked accidental. They were waiting. A herd of elephants stood just beyond the cattle grid, silent and unnaturally still. Not the orphaned youngsters from the refuge, not animals used to hay wagons and human voices, but fully wild elephants from the protected range to the north. 7 adults, broad as moving walls, formed a crescent across the entrance road, blocking it without a single threatening move. Ethan lowered the coffee cup without taking his eyes off them. No ears flared in warning. No trunks slapped the ground. No mock charges came to test the fence line. The elephants held position with an eerie patience that unsettled him more than aggression would have. It looked less like a standoff than a vigil, as if they were guarding something too important to leave. He radioed the main house, and within minutes, Dr. Leah Bennett arrived in a field jacket over her scrubs, gray hair pulled back, reading glasses still hanging from her collar. Ava Brooks came on her heels, half awake and trying to hide it, followed by Marlon Hayes from the transport shed. Even before they reached Ethan, they felt the pressure of the scene settle over them. Leah studied the herd for a long moment and said nothing. She had spent 30 years around elephants in reserves, conflict zones, and rescue units across southern Africa. She knew the difference between alert, defensive, and grieving. What stood at the gate that morning did not fit any category she trusted. The animals were not there to fight, and somehow that was worse. Ava was the first to notice the gap at the center of their formation. It was small, half hidden by the matriarch's shoulder and the angled bodies around her. But something lay on the ground behind them, just a patch of softer shape against the dust. She caught her breath and stepped closer before Ethan reached out, stopping her with one hand to her arm and a warning she barely heard. The matriarch stood at the center of it all, scarred and immense, her left tusk chipped near the base as if a piece of old ivory had snapped away years ago. Her trunk drifted once above the ground, then went still. When Leah took another step forward, the old cow did not challenge her. She only watched, eyes dark and unreadable, carrying a calm that felt terrifyingly deliberate. Against every safety rule on the refuge books, Leah told Ethan to unlatch the outer gate. He stared at her, certain he had heard wrong. Marlon muttered that this was insane. Ava said nothing at all. She was looking past the bars at that motionless shape between the adults, and something inside her had already decided. Ethan opened the gate with hands that felt colder than the morning air. The hinges gave a metallic groan that shattered the silence. Then, with a slowness so measured it seemed ceremonial, the elephants parted. One by one, they stepped aside just enough to reveal what they had been protecting. In the dust lay a newborn calf, folded onto its side, skin still loose with the creases of birth, body so small it seemed impossible beside such giants. For a second, no one moved. The calf was alive, but only barely. Its ribs lifted in shallow, uncertain pulls, each breath so thin Ava thought she might have imagined it. One hind leg was tangled with a length of dried vine and burr grass, as if it had been dragged through scrub or fought its way loose from something that had tried to keep it. No mother stood near it. Leah crossed the ground slowly, hands open, voice low. Ethan expected the matriarch to stop her at any second, to explode into sound and force. Instead, the herd remained fixed where they were, every adult watching with the same impossible restraint. When Leah knelt beside the calf and touched its neck, she found a pulse, faint, fluttering, but there, still here, she whispered. Ava saw it then. The calf's eyelid trembled without opening, and its trunk gave a weak, broken twitch toward the sound of human voices. Not toward the herd, toward the strangers. It was a tiny movement, almost nothing, yet it struck her harder than panic would have. Whatever had happened before dawn, this infant had been carried to the only place it might survive, and somehow it had arrived in time. The old matriarch did not move when Leah rose from the dust. For one suspended moment, woman and elephant held each other's gaze across a distance that felt older than language. Then the great cow turned her head toward the tree line, as if some silent decision had finally been made. The rest of the herd waited for her cue. It happened with almost unbearable gentleness. One adult stepped back, then another. A younger female brushed her trunk once along the calf's spine, lingering there as if memorizing the shape of that tiny body. No cries broke the morning. No trumpeting split the air. The wild herd simply began to loosen, like hands forced to open around something precious. Ava saw one thing no one else seemed to catch. A younger cow, not the matriarch, took 2 slow steps away and then turned back toward the newborn. Her ears hung low. Her trunk lifted halfway, then dropped again. It was not the posture of confusion. It looked heartbreakingly close to grief, and it made the whole scene feel less like abandonment than surrender. "Move now," Leah said, her voice barely above breath. That was all it took. Ethan and Marlin came in fast with a padded field sling, every motion careful, every heartbeat too loud inside their own chests. Up close, the calf looked even smaller than it had from the gate, its skin dry in places, damp in others, the fragile body still holding the softness of first hours. When Ethan slipped his hands beneath the calf's chest, he felt almost no resistance. The newborn weighed far too little, as if life itself had failed to fully settle into its bones. One foreleg folded strangely under the body, and the hind leg still carried bits of thorn and vine. Marlin cut the snare of dried stems free, while Leah steadied the calf's head in her palms. Then the infant made a sound. It was not a cry in the way people imagined animal cries. It was smaller than that, thinner, like a breath scraping its way through a body too tired to call for help. Ava froze where she stood. The sound lasted only a second, but it turned the scene from shocking to unbearable. This baby had not given up yet. As they lifted the calf, the herd shifted all at once. Ethan's spine went rigid, certain the charge was finally coming. But instead of surging forward, the adults closed ranks around the matriarch and faced the humans one last time. Dust rose around their ankles. Their silence carried more force than noise ever could, and for a moment, nobody dared breathe. Leah cradled the calf's head against a folded blanket, while Marlin and Ethan carried the sling toward the open gate. Ava walked beside them, one hand hovering near the infant's shoulder, too afraid to touch, too unable not to try. Behind them, the herd remained where it was, a line of still bodies dark against the pale road and brightening sky. Only when the calf crossed fully into refuge ground did the matriarch turn away. She did not hurry. She did not look back. She started toward the acacia scrub with the solemn pace of something ancient and final, and the others followed her. One by one, those enormous shapes vanished into the low brush, leaving the gate wide open and the world strangely emptied by their absence. Inside the treatment barn, the newborn was placed under warm lamps on a bed of thick towels. The room smelled of hay, iodine, metal, and the faint sweetness of formula meant for calves already stable enough to swallow. This little one was nowhere near that. Its breaths came shallow and irregular, and its eyelids trembled without ever fully opening to the light. Leah worked fast, but not hurried. She checked temperature, gums, pulse, belly tone, reflexes, building a grim picture with each quiet touch. Severe dehydration, dangerous heat loss, weak cardiac response. The calf's umbilical stump was still fresh enough to suggest it had been born less than 2 days earlier. Whatever had separated it from its mother had happened almost immediately and violently. As Marlin cleaned mud from the hindquarters, a sharp smell lifted from the coat beneath the dust. Ethan leaned closer and caught it too. Smoke, old but distinct, threaded through the scent of earth and milk. Along the calf's flank, hidden under grime, were tiny specks of singed hair. Nobody said the thought aloud, but it entered the room all the same. Fire had touched this story somehow. Ava brought warm cloths and fresh blankets with hands that would not quite stop shaking. When Leah asked for the smallest feeding tube and a heated saline line, her tone remained steady, almost gentle, but her face had changed. She was no longer looking at a mystery left by wild elephants. She was looking at a newborn already sliding toward death, and she knew time was narrowing fast. Before beginning the first emergency treatment, Leah rested her hand once more against the calf's neck and listened to that failing pulse. "We need a name," Ava said softly, surprising herself as much as the others. The room went quiet. Leah glanced at the tiny body under the lamp, then answered in a voice made of exhaustion and care. "Micah," she said, and for the first time, the dying calf belonged to someone. By the time the sun cleared the trees, Micah's body had begun to lose its fight in visible ways. The warmth from the lamps stayed on his skin, but did not seem to sink into him. His ears felt cold at the edges. His breaths came in uneven, little pulls, as if each one had to be persuaded. Even lying still, he looked exhausted by the effort of remaining alive. Leah started the first heated fluids, while Ethan logged every number with a steadiness he did not feel. Temperature dangerously low, hydration poor, heart rhythm weak and erratic. The tiny veins in Micah's ears were difficult to catch, collapsing almost as soon as they were found. More than once, Leah had to pause and try again, not from doubt, but from the sheer fragility of the calf. Ava stayed close enough to hand over gauze, syringes, and warmed cloths, but her eyes kept returning to Micah's face. His lashes were dusted with red grit. His trunk twitched every so often, then went still again. Once, his mouth opened in a searching motion that should have led him to his mother. Instead, it met air, lamplight, and the soft, helpless silence of strangers trying to stand in for a whole herd. Leah examined the hind leg more carefully once the vine had been removed, and the debris washed away. There was swelling above the ankle and faint bruising under the skin, where something had either bound it tight or dragged against it over distance. Not broken, she thought, but injured enough to make standing nearly impossible. For a newborn, that alone could become a death sentence. Marlin kept wiping the calf down, and with every layer of dust that came off, the story became more troubling. Beneath the dirt were tiny flecks of char along Micah's flank, singed hairs near the shoulder, and soot pressed into the folds of his skin. Ethan smelled it again too, unmistakable now, smoke, ash, and the stale bitterness of ground that had burned recently. Something more than separation had touched this beginning. Nobody wanted to say what they were thinking. A brush fire, a poacher's camp, a panicked crossing through scorched scrub after the mother went down. Botswana's dry season had 1,000 cruel ways to break a life open, and Micah wore too many signs. Of all of them, Leah stayed with what she could prove. Less than 48 hours old, no effective feeding, heavy fluid loss, very little time left. She checked his blood sugar, and the reading hit lower than she expected. Noah Whitaker was called before the results strip even finished processing. Leah trusted her own judgment, but this calf was moving toward a cliff too fast for pride. Noah worked mobile large animal cases across the district, rough-edged, brilliant, and difficult. The kind of doctor people called when normal measures had already begun to fail. While they waited, Micah made another effort to move. It started in the shoulders, a tremor no bigger than a shiver, then pushed through his neck until his head lifted an inch from the towel. Ava leaned forward, hope flashing too fast in her chest. The effort lasted only a second. His head dropped back with a soft thud, and the room changed around that tiny failure. He had tried. It simply cost him too much. Ethan stepped outside to answer Noah's return call, where the others would not hear the strain in his voice. He gave the numbers, the symptoms, the likely age, and left out the part that still sounded impossible, that a wild herd had delivered the calf themselves. Noah listened in silence before saying he was on his way. Then he added, flat and unsentimental, "Don't let anyone fall in love with the odds." Inside, Ava was already doing exactly that. She sat beside the warming bed and laid a hand near Micah's shoulder without pressing down. The calf's breathing did not improve, not really, but it seemed to settle into a less frantic rhythm. Leah noticed and said nothing. Some things had no place in a chart, yet mattered anyway. A newborn could die from shock as surely as from injury, and loneliness had its own temperature. Late that morning, the first feeding attempt failed almost as soon as it began. Micah could not form suction, could not coordinate trunk, tongue, and swallow the way a calf his age should have started learning within hours of birth. Formula touched his mouth, and he turned weakly away. Leah stopped before he aspirated. There was no frustration in her face, only the colder fear that comes when the body refuses even rescue. Noah arrived in a dust-streaked truck just past noon, carrying 2 medical cases and a fatigue that looked permanent. He took one long look at Micah, then set his gear down without ceremony. His hands were practiced, quick, and unsparing as he repeated the exam, studied the leg, smelled the singed coat, and read the monitors. Nothing about his expression offered comfort. That, somehow, made everyone trust him more. When he finished, Noah rested both palms on the edge of the warming table and looked at Leah first, then at the calf. "If he makes it to morning," he said quietly, "that'll be the first miracle." No one answered. Outside, the day had turned bright and merciless, burning the last softness out of dawn. Inside, under the hum of heaters and the thin sound of failing breath, Micah lay between this world and the next. Night settled over Red Clay Elephant Refuge without softness. The heat of day bled out of the earth, leaving the treatment barn wrapped in a chill that pressed against the walls and slipped under every door. Inside, lamps glowed amber over Micah's small body, but the warmth they offered felt fragile, like a promise that could be broken by one bad hour. The newborn had grown quieter as darkness deepened. At first, Ava thought that meant he was finally resting, but Leah knew better. Healthy rest had a rhythm to it, a looseness in the jaw, a steadiness in the chest. Micah had none of that. His stillness looked costly, as if his body had stopped wasting strength on anything that was not absolutely necessary to survive another minute. Noah adjusted the drip rate and watched the monitor clip to Micah's ear. The numbers flickered in uneven patterns that made his mouth flatten. He wanted more aggressive fluids, faster correction, stronger support before the calf slid too far to recover. Leah held her ground. Too much, too fast, and Micah's system might collapse under the treatment meant to save him. The argument never rose into shouting, but it sharpened the air all the same. Ethan stayed near the doorway with a flashlight and clipboard, pretending to be useful in ways that did not require anyone to notice how invested he had become. Marlin moved in and out of the barn, heating blankets, boiling water, bringing fresh saline, then leaving again before the strain in his face could settle into words. No one had planned to spend the night fighting for a life that morning had placed in their hands. The first alarm sounded just after 10. A thin electronic chirp cut through the barn, small and vicious, announcing another drop in body temperature. Ava flinched so hard she nearly knocked over a tray of syringes. Leah was at the warming bed in 2 steps, laying one hand along Micah's neck, the other against his chest, searching for change not in the machine, but in the calf himself. The cold had returned beneath the skin. They packed warm towels around him, switched out heat pads, checked the line, checked the monitor, checked everything twice. Micah responded with a faint shiver that barely moved his ribs. Then came a tremor in the forelegs, slight but unmistakable, followed by a second one stronger than the first. Noah recognized it before anyone spoke. Electrolytes were slipping again. If the imbalance deepened, the calf's heart could go with it. Leah called for a corrected mix. Noah already had it in hand. For a few tense minutes, the two of them worked shoulder to shoulder in a silence more intimate than trust and more urgent than disagreement. Ava stood at Micah's head, murmuring nonsense she did not even hear herself saying. The words were useless, but the sound of them filled the spaces between alarms, giving the room something gentler than fear to hold on to. Around midnight, they tried to feed him again, Noah guided the bottle. Leah steadied the jaw. Ava touched Micah lightly between the eyes, hoping the contact might keep him from panicking if he had strength enough left to panic. For 1 second, the nipple met his mouth and stayed there. Then his throat failed the swallow. Formula spilled down his chin, and the whole attempt had to stop before it stole more breath than it gave. Noah turned away first, not out of anger, but to keep his frustration from landing on the others. Leah stripped off her gloves and stood perfectly still, the way she did when forcing herself to think instead of react. This was the part outsiders never saw, the quiet humiliation of effort, the body refusing every reasonable invitation to live. Micah was not recovering. He was negotiating, inch by inch, with whatever waited beyond the light. Sometime after 1 a.m, the power flickered. Just once. Then again. The heaters dipped low enough for everyone in the barn to notice. Ethan was already moving before the 3rd flicker hit, heading for the backup generator shed at a run. Outside, the wind had come up hard out of nowhere, carrying dust and the smell of dry brush over the yard. Even the night seemed determined to make this harder. When the generator kicked in, the lamp steadied, but Micah did not. His breathing had changed, becoming shallow in a way that frightened even Noah. There were pauses now, brief, terrible silences between breaths that made Ava lean closer each time, certain the next inhale would not come. Leah counted under her breath, one hand over the calf's chest, not touching hard, just reminding herself that movement was still there. Then, from somewhere deep inside that failing body, Micah made a sound. It was so thin Ava almost missed it, a worn little rasp, more felt than heard. His trunk twitched toward the warmth beside him, toward the human shape nearest his head. Ava bent, close, tears already hot in her eyes, and spoke to him as if he had asked a question only she could hear. For the first time all night, his breathing eased by half a measure. No one said what they were thinking. Not Leah, who saw the smallest shift in his chest. Not Noah, who noticed the monitor settling from chaos into something barely less dangerous. Not Ethan, who had come back from the generator shed with grease on his hands and stopped dead in the doorway. It was too little to call improvement, too brief to trust, but it was not nothing, and tonight, nothing and something stood miles apart. The barn grew quieter after that, not peaceful, not safe, but quieter. Micah still hovered at the edge of every fear in the room, and morning remained far away. Yet the sharpest panic had passed, leaving behind a softer, shakier kind of hope. Ava stayed seated beside the warming bed, her hand near Micah's shoulder, listening to the thin pull of each breath and waiting for the dark to loosen its hold. Morning came slowly, as if even the sun was reluctant to disturb the fragile balance inside the barn. The generator had held through the last hours of darkness, and the heaters still cast their steady amber glow over Micah's bedding. He was alive. That simple fact should have felt victorious. Instead, it felt delicate, like a breath caught in cupped hands. A pale strip of light stretched across the concrete floor, while Ava sat exactly where she had been before dawn, knees tucked under her, shoulders stiff with cold and exhaustion. She had not slept. Neither had Leah. Noah had dozed once in a chair for perhaps 15 minutes, boots still on, only to wake at the slightest change in Micah's breathing. Survival had narrowed all of them into the same exhausted orbit. Micah looked different in daylight, and not in ways that comforted anyone. The red dust was mostly gone now, revealing the true color of his skin. soft gray darkened by patches of bruising, with a faint pinkness around the ears and mouth that belonged to something much too new for pain like this. His eyes still would not fully open. His body seemed caught between first life and first loss. Leah checked his vitals again, slower this time, building a quieter kind of truth from what remained. Temperature still low, but no longer dropping. Heart rhythm weak, though less chaotic than it had been in the night. Hydration poor. Muscle tone nearly absent. Micah had not crossed into safety. He had only pulled back from the edge far enough to make everyone afraid of hoping too soon. When Ava reached for a clean cloth, Micah's trunk moved before the rest of him did. It wasn't much, just a faint curling motion in her direction, clumsy and incomplete, as if the instinct arrived before the strength. Ava froze, cloth in hand, then slowly lowered herself beside him. His trunk brushed the sleeve of her jacket and rested there for a second. The contact was so slight it might have been dismissed as random. It wasn't. Noah saw it too. He did not smile, but something in his face eased. "He knows where the calm is," he said, voice rough from too much coffee and too little sleep. Leah did not answer right away. She was studying Micah, not as a miracle, but as a pattern. There were calves who fought medicine, and calves who fought loneliness harder than either. Some bodies stabilized only when fear did. The next feeding attempt came with lower expectations and more care. Leah switched to a smaller bottle and changed Micah's angle, letting Ava stay near his head while Noah monitored the swallow reflex. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Micah opened his mouth weakly, found the nipple, and held it there. He did not latch fully. He did not drink much. But for the first time, he did not turn away. Ava did not realize she was crying until a tear dropped onto the back of her hand. Micah took in only a few small pulls before tiring out, yet those tiny swallows changed the air in the room. Marlon, who had just come in with fresh blankets, stopped dead at the doorway. Ethan lowered his clipboard. Noah quietly checked the calf's throat and nodded once. It was not feeding, not really, but it was the beginning of one. That fragile hope lasted less than an hour before the next fear arrived. While cleaning the hind leg more thoroughly, Leah uncovered swelling that had spread upward through the joint. The tissue was warm in a way the rest of Micah's body was not, and when she pressed lightly along the tendon, the calf flinched with his first unmistakable sign of pain. The response should have been reassuring. Instead, it sharpened the problem. An X-ray unit was too much to drag into the barn without stress they could not risk, so Noah worked by palpation and instinct, reading the leg through his hands. Not broken, he thought again, but damaged enough to threaten the calf's future. A strained joint, maybe deeper tearing around the soft tissue. A newborn. Elephant needed strength in all four limbs, just to rise, nurse, follow, and survive. Micah could live and still lose the life meant for him. Ava listened from across the room, her face draining as Leah and Noah spoke in low voices they assumed she could not hear. A splint might help, or it might create pressure his skin could not tolerate yet. More movement could worsen the injury, but too little movement would weaken him further. The truth settled over her in pieces. Saving Micah from dying was only the first battle. Saving him from a broken future would be another. As if the morning had not already taken enough from them, Ethan returned from a perimeter check, carrying one more piece of the wild with him. He had found fresh elephant tracks on the ridge beyond the east water tanks. Large prints, several adults, no more than a few hours old. One of them had a drag mark beside it, where a chipped tusk or low-hanging trunk had brushed the dust. The herd had not gone far. Marlin was the first to speak. "They came back?" No one answered right away. Ethan stood in the barn doorway with red dirt still on his boots, looking past all of them to Micah. The calf lay under warming lamps, one tiny ear twitching at the murmur of voices, his injured leg stretched awkwardly on the towel. Outside, somewhere beyond the acacias, the same wild giants who had left him there might still be watching. Leah returned to Micah's side and adjusted the blanket around his shoulders with a touch so careful it barely disturbed him. Ava knelt beside the bedding, letting the calf's trunk rest again against her sleeve. Nothing was solved. The injury remained. The feeding was uncertain. Night would come again. But now there was a name, a first swallow, and the unsettling knowledge that the story had not ended at the gate. It had only just begun. The days that followed did not move like normal days. They stretched, folded, and blurred into one another, measured less by clocks than by feedings, temperature checks, and the fragile rise and fall of Micah's chest. Outside, Red Clay Elephant Refuge kept its ordinary rhythm. Trucks on gravel, workers at the pens, birds flashing through the acacias. Inside the treatment barn, everything revolved around one calf. Micah survived the second night, then the third, and with each morning, he seemed a little more present in his own body. Not stronger, not yet, but less absent. His eyes began to open in brief, unfocused slivers. His trunk no longer lay motionless for hours at a time. Sometimes it drifted weakly across the bedding, as if searching for something he still believed ought to be there. A mother's leg, a heartbeat, a world that had vanished too soon. Ava became part of that search without meaning to. She was there at the first bottle, at the last one before dawn, at the quiet stretches in between when Micah fought sleep because each waking seemed uncertain. He responded to others, but he settled for her. When she spoke, the tension in his jaw softened. When her hand rested near his shoulder, his breathing found a steadier rhythm, as if her presence gave his body permission not to panic. Leah noticed it before anyone said it out loud. She had seen bonds form in rescue work before, between animals and people, between the living and whatever kept them from slipping away. Some bonds healed, some complicated everything. She said nothing at first, only watched as Micah turned his head, however slightly, whenever Ava entered the room. It was too early to call it attachment, too real to ignore. The first clear sign came during a feeding just after sunrise on the 5th day. Micah had already refused twice, tiring himself out in the effort of not knowing what to do. Noah adjusted the bottle. Leah steadied the neck. It was Ava, leaning close and speaking low near his ear, who made him pause. Then, with a clumsy little motion, he found the nipple and held it. One swallow, then another, then 3 more. Nobody in the room dared celebrate while it was happening. They had learned too quickly how cruel false hope could be. But when Micah finally released the bottle on his own, instead of failing away from it, Marlin let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Ethan looked down at his notes to hide the sudden sting in his eyes. Even Noah's expression shifted, if only by a fraction. Progress had entered the room quietly. It was not enough to make the day easy. A fever arrived by afternoon, small at first, then higher by evening. The injured hind leg had swollen again, hot under the skin, the tissue tight with inflammation that threatened to turn a bad beginning into a lifelong weakness. Leah and Noah argued in low, clipped voices over anti-inflammatory dosing, splint support, and whether Micah could tolerate more intervention without unraveling the fragile gains he had made. Ava heard enough to understand the shape of the fear. Micah might live. That possibility, once impossible, was now real enough to hurt. But if the leg failed to heal well, if infection took hold, if the joint stiffened or weakened too much, survival could become its own kind of cruelty. A calf that could not stand properly, could not follow a herd, could not forage, could not belong. Life was opening, but so was loss. That evening, while Leah reviewed medications and Noah called for a specialist opinion from Mound, Ethan brought in something he had found near the outer ridge. It was a broken acacia branch, blackened at one end, carrying the unmistakable smell of old smoke. He set it on the workbench without a word. The room changed around it. Fire was no longer a theory clinging to Micah's coat. Somewhere out there, the land had burned, and the calf had come through it. No one said the next thought aloud, though they all felt it. If Micah's mother had gone down in smoke, injury, or chaos, then the herd had made choices afterward. They had kept the newborn moving. They had carried him, because there was no other explanation left, to the one place in the region where humans might save what the wild no longer could. The idea was too large to hold comfortably. It hung over everything they did. On the seventh morning, Micah tried to rise. It began as a push through his forelegs, awkward and trembling, his head lifting high enough to tip him off balance. Ava moved instinctively, but Leah stopped her with a hand to the wrist. If he could do this at all, he had to learn what his body could manage without rescue rushing in too soon. The barn went silent, except for the rasp of Micah's breath and the scrape of his knees against the bedding. He made it halfway up before the injured hind leg buckled. The fall was not dramatic, just sad, his small body folding back to earth with a softness that somehow hurt more than violence. Ava turned away for a second, hand over her mouth. Noah muttered a curse under his breath. Leah stayed still, watching not the failure itself, but what came after. Micah lay stunned, breathing hard, then lifted his head again. He had not quit. That afternoon, Ava carried fresh towels into the small recovery pen beside the treatment bay, the one Leah had prepared for the day Micah might need more room to move. It was still too soon to use it, but seeing it ready changed something in her. For the first time, the future did not feel like a lie told to comfort the exhausted. It felt distant, difficult, and painfully uncertain, but possible enough to prepare for. Late in the day, as the light turned honey-colored through the barn slats, Micah rested with his trunk curled against Ava's sleeve. His fever had eased a little. The swelling in the leg had not worsened. He had taken more formula than the day before, though nowhere near enough to relax anyone. Leah stood at the doorway watching them, her face unreadable. She knew what Ava did not yet fully understand. If Micah kept choosing her, one day she might have to teach him to let go. By the second week, Micah no longer looked like a calf waiting to die. He still looked fragile, still too small for the long legs he had been born into, but life had begun to settle inside him with more conviction. The change was not dramatic. It lived in small things. The way his eyes stayed open longer, the way he searched for the bottle before it touched his mouth, the way he noticed footsteps before voices. The treatment barn had changed with him. The sharp urgency of those first nights gave way to a more disciplined kind of strain, the kind that came when survival stopped being a miracle and became a responsibility. Feedings had to be exact. Rest periods had to be protected. The injured hind leg had to be managed carefully enough to heal without teaching the rest of his body the wrong way to stand. Every gain brought new ways to fail. Leah began expanding Micah's world by inches. He was moved from the warming bed into the small recovery pen during the day, where the bedding was deeper and the air carried more of the refuge around him: hay, dust, warm metal, sunlight through wood slats. Ava stayed close during the first transfer, kneeling at the edge of the pen while Micah's trunk reached for her with the same blind certainty he once reserved for breath itself. That certainty, beautiful as it was, had started to trouble Leah. Micah no longer calmed only because a human voice was nearby. He calmed for one human voice in particular. When Ava stepped out, even briefly, his body changed. He became restless, head lifting, trunk sweeping the air, soft distress sounds gathering in his throat. They were not loud, but they were unmistakable. He was beginning to choose her over the world around him. Noah saw it too and mentioned it gently, almost as a warning offered to no one in particular. A bond like that could save a calf in the beginning. It could also trap one there. Wild elephants did not survive because they loved humans. They survived because they learned herd language, distance, pressure, timing, leadership, surrender. If Micah learned Ava too deeply and too well, he might carry the wrong map into the rest of his life. That was why Leah made the decision she had been postponing. Ruby would be brought closer. The young orphaned female was nearly 2, calm by nature, and already stable with the other rescue calves. She had lost her mother in drought country and had taken to refuge life with a quiet resilience that made the keepers trust her. If anyone could become the first safe bridge between Micah and his own kind, it would be her. The first introduction happened through a reinforced rail partition just outside the barn. Ruby arrived with deliberate, careful steps, escorted loosely by Marlin and one of the afternoon keepers. She was much larger than Micah, though still young enough to carry uncertainty in the way she held her trunk. Micah froze the instant he saw her. His ears gave a tiny, nervous flick. Then, without thinking, he backed against Ava's legs. No one rushed the moment. Leah stood a few yards away with her arms folded, watching body language the way other people watched weather. Ruby lifted her trunk and tested the air. Micah answered with a weak little reach of his own, then pulled back again. The space between them became the whole room, alive with instinct, memory, and the first awkward edge of recognition. 2 calves, both orphaned, both still learning what had been taken from them. Ruby touched the rail once, then lowered her trunk toward Micah through the gap. He startled hard enough to lose his footing and nearly sat down. Ava bent at once, but Leah caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. Let him feel it. Let him decide. Micah stood trembling, trunk curled tight, gaze fixed on Ruby's outstretched tip, as if it were something both dangerous and desperately familiar. At last, he leaned forward. The touch lasted less than a second. Trunk to trunk. Warm. Breath shared, then gone. But the effect moved through the pen like a current. Ruby did not crowd him. She did not demand more. She only stayed where she was, calm and unoffended by his fear. Micah blinked, swayed, and then, almost guiltily, looked back at Ava, as if checking whether he had strayed too far from the place that had kept him alive. Ethan had been watching from the doorway, with a clipboard tucked under one arm, saying nothing, trying not to interfere with something he suspected mattered more than any chart. Later, he would remember that tiny moment better than some emergencies. The first time Micah touched another elephant and did not collapse into panic. It was so small, no outsider would have noticed. Inside the refuge, it felt like the future had cracked open by a hair. The second introduction came easier. Ruby returned in the afternoon and stood longer at the partition. This time, Micah did not hide as fast. He still stayed close to Ava, but not pressed against her. His trunk reached out twice before making contact, each attempt steadier than the last. When Ruby brushed the side of his face in a gesture older calves use to reassure the very young, Micah closed his eyes and held still, as if some buried memory had been stirred. That evening, Leah found Ava alone in the feed room, rinsing bottles long after the others had moved on to supper. Ava looked tired in a way that had gone beyond lack of sleep. She already understood what Leah had not yet said. Micah had to keep turning toward Ruby, then toward others, then, eventually, toward a herd. Leah rested against the doorframe and spoke quietly. "Loving him isn't the hard part," she said. "Letting him become an elephant will be." Ava did not answer right away. Through the open window, she could hear the low sounds of the calf pens outside, and, somewhere farther off, Ruby's deeper rumble folding into the evening air. In the recovery stall, Micah would be settling for the night, fed and warm, carrying into sleep the feel of another trunk against his own. It should have felt like progress. It did. But for the first time, progress came with grief, quietly threaded through it. 3 months after the morning at the gate, Micah crossed the outer yard on his own legs with a gait that was still uneven, but recognizably his. The limp had softened into a hitch that showed most when he was tired, and the fear that once lived in every movement no longer ruled him. He had grown taller, broader through the chest, and more certain of where his feet belonged on the earth. By then, the recovery pen behind the treatment barn had become too small for the life gathering inside him. Ruby had long since stopped being a stranger at the rail and had taken on the patient authority of an older sister. Finn, all energy and curiosity, tried to pull Micah into clumsy little games the smaller calf did not always understand. And looming above them both was Gideon, a rangy juvenile male who tolerated chaos only on his own terms. Gideon had not welcomed Micah at first. He watched him with the cool, appraising distance young males often gave weakness, as if deciding whether the calf belonged in their loose, improvised society. More than once, he blocked Micah from a water trough or shoved past him with deliberate shoulder pressure. It was not cruelty, Leah said. It was testing. In elephant life, acceptance was rarely handed over untouched. Micah met those tests the way he met everything at first, with caution, then stubbornness. When Gideon crowded him away from a feed pan one hot afternoon, Micah retreated 2 steps, steadied himself, and came back. He was too small to challenge, too young to posture, but he held his ground long enough to make Gideon stop and stare. Then Ruby moved between them with a low rumble, and the matter, for now, was finished. Ava witnessed most of those moments from farther away than she would have chosen. Leah had begun reducing her direct contact with Micah by degrees so small they felt almost merciful. Fewer bottle feedings from her hands, more time for other keepers, longer stretches when Micah had to settle without her voice nearby. Each change left a mark on him at first. He called for her. He searched. He refused sleep. Then, slowly, he adapted. The hardest part had not been walking away. It had been staying away long enough for the lesson to take root. Ava learned to stand outside the enclosure with her hands folded tight, watching Ruby guide Micah toward shade, or Finn tug him toward the mud wallow, resisting the instinct to step in just because she still could. Leah was right. Love was not the same as rescue, and rescue was not meant to become a cage. By the start of the rainy winds, Micah was ready for the reintegration paddock on the far side of the refuge. It was larger, rougher, bordered by acacia scrub instead of wooden fencing, with enough space for the calves to browse, spar, wander, and disappear from human eyes for little stretches at a time. The move was meant to be hopeful. Instead, it made everyone nervous. Bigger spaces made room for growth. They also made room for loss. The storm came on a night when the sky had been wrong since sunset. Heavy clouds pressed low over the land, swallowing the moon and flattening every sound. By the time the first sheet of rain struck the tin roofs, the refuge was already moving. Keepers checking latches, Ethan running the perimeter, Marlin securing transport gear that no one wanted to need. In the reintegration paddock, the calves milled close, restlessness rippling through them. Then lightning hit somewhere beyond the ridge, and the world split white. A section of old fencing at the far drainage trench gave way under wind and runoff, collapsing into the mud. The calves scattered in blind panic. Ruby wheeled toward the younger ones. Finn bolted, then doubled back. Gideon shoved through the confusion with his ears out and trunk raised. In the middle of it all, Micah vanished into the rain. Ava heard the call before anyone found him. Not a full trumpet, not even close, just a raw, breaking cry from somewhere beyond the floodlit paddock. Ethan took a rope and a flashlight and went over the broken line without hesitation. Ava followed before Leah could stop her. They found Micah half slid into the drainage channel, forelegs scrabbling, injured hind leg buried deep in sucking mud that held him tighter each time he fought it. He was terrified in a way they had not seen since the barn. Mud streaked his flanks. Rain ran over his eyes. Every attempt to free himself drove him deeper, and the more Ava called his name, the more frantic he became. Ethan dropped into the trench on one side while Ava stayed at the bank, talking to Micah through the rain, not to calm him completely. There was no calming this, but to keep him fixed on a voice instead of the panic. Then another sound rose through the storm, low and resonant enough to be felt before it was heard. Ruby had reached the edge of the trench with Gideon just behind her. Finn lingered back, trembling, but he stayed. Ruby extended her trunk down toward Micah, not close enough to pull, only close enough to remain there, steady, present, unafraid. For one suspended second, the calf stopped thrashing and turned toward her instead of Ava. That pause gave Ethan the opening he needed. With Marlin on the line above and the rain turning the ground slick beneath them, he got the rescue strap under Micah's chest. It took all of them, human strain, rope, shouted timing, and Micah's own desperate kick, to haul the calf free of the trench. He collapsed onto solid ground, shaking so hard The water trembled under him. Ava dropped to her knees, certain he would crawl straight into her arms. He didn't. He lifted his head, found Ruby through the rain, and dragged himself toward her. She met him halfway, trunk laid across the back of his neck, while Gideon stood close, enough to form a barrier against the wind. Ava stayed where she was, soaked through, mud on her hands, heart cracking open around the sight. It hurt more than she expected. It also felt exactly right. In the worst moment of his fear, Micah had chosen an elephant. After the storm, something in him settled for good. Not all at once, and not cleanly. He still greeted Ava with unmistakable recognition when she came near. He still carried traces of his first bond, like a scar that no longer hurt, but never fully vanished. Yet his center had shifted. He slept closer to Ruby. He followed Gideon's cues at a feeding time. He moved with the others instead of checking constantly for where the humans stood. Weeks later, on a dry, gold afternoon, the impossible happened in a way no one had scripted, no one had dared promise. Ethan was on the observation ridge when he spotted a wild herd standing on the high ground beyond the boundary scrub. 7 adults, silent, watching. He radioed Leah, and by the time the staff gathered at a distance, Micah had already lifted his head toward them, body gone perfectly still in the warm wind. At the front stood an old matriarch with a chip missing from her left tusk. Time did not collapse in that moment, so much as fold neatly back on itself. Micah took several slow steps forward, Ruby flanking him, Gideon behind. The wild herd did not advance. They did not retreat. Then the matriarch released a deep, rolling rumble that seemed to move through the ground itself. Micah answered with one of his own, small, rough, but unmistakable. No fence was crossed, no dramatic reunion followed. The herd simply remained for several minutes, as if witnessing was enough. Then the matriarch turned, and the others turned with her, melting back into the scrub with the same solemn purpose they had carried to the gate months before. Leah stood with one hand over her mouth. Ethan could not speak. Ava watched Micah watching them go, and understood that some recognitions needed no human translation. The final proof came not from the wild herd, but from what Micah did after. A new orphan arrived at the refuge not long later, a tiny female the keepers named Luna, rigid with grief and too frightened to drink. While the staff debated the gentlest way to begin, Micah approached her with a care that made everyone fall silent. He did not crowd her. He only stood nearby, waiting, then laid his trunk lightly against her cheek. Luna flinched at first, then stilled. Ruby watched from a few yards away. Ava felt tears rise before she could stop them. The calf carried to humans at the edge of death had become part of the chain that saved another life. That was the thing none of them could have imagined on the morning the herd appeared at the gate. Micah had not only survived the impossible, he had learned how to pass it on. If this story moved you, leave a 1 in the comments. If you believe animals understand more than we'll ever know, leave a 0. And if Micah's journey touched your heart, take 1 second to tell us where you're watching from. I read your comments, and they truly mean a lot. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are many more powerful stories ahead. Stories about courage, loss, second chances, and the quiet bond between animals and people that words can't always explain. Stay with us for the next story. You won't want to miss what comes next.